Japanese from US citizenship, so they had no choice. Reverend Watanabe was interned due to what the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which was passed by Congress over 40 years later, determined was racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. Nevertheless, he was imprisoned in Hawaii from December 7th. And you can see here his mugshot. He was actually imprisoned at the Sand Island Internment Camp, and then exiled thousands of miles away to the mainland. So this top map shows you the route that he and his the men on his transfer boat took from Angel Island to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, then Camp Lordsburg and the Santa Fe Internment Camp in New Mexico. There are a few examples of Fort Sam Houston. The internees were up here in the corner, but the Signal Corps actually labeled it concentration camp, POW camp. And these were the tents that they were housed in. So they were there for 10 days at Fort Sam Houston, which was, as you could see, an army camp. And then a year in Lordsburg, which is also an army camp. And we don't really have photos of the camp itself, but George Hoshida sketched these two photos and kept many visual records for us. They were 2.5 years at the Santa Fe Internment Camp, which was built on a CCC camp that already existed. And here is an internee's interpretation of what the camp looked like. This was also, this was run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Border Patrol. And they were there from June 23rd, 1943 to October 30th, 1945. It took them a couple of weeks to actually return to Hawaii. So Reverend Watanabe was one of hundreds of men from Hawaii, one of thousands from the entire US, many leaders in their Japanese communities, imprisoned by the Department of Justice and the War Department, who actually had an agreement, a collaborative agreement, as early as July 1941, which was 6 months before Pearl Harbor was attacked. While interned, he belonged in many ways to different groups of men. Those exiled from Hawaii to the mainland on Transfer Boat 3, departing on May 23rd, 1942 for Angel Island, California. He is here in the corner on the right side. And this group was in many ways a microcosm of the whole. In this photo are at least one Buddhist minister, Reverend Fujitani, a Shinto priest, over here, Reverend Ikuma, a coffee farmer, Mr. Kato, 2 Japanese school principals, Mr. Ohama and Mr. Mizutari, a businessman, Mr. Shigenaga, an attorney, Mr. Kawasaki, a plantation worker, Mr. Kinoshita, and himself a Christian minister over here. This is just to my knowledge. I just happened to interview enough families and discover that all of the men were on the same transfer boat, and so I identified this photo, which was not labeled as a transfer boat photo. So there were 10 transfer boatloads from Hawaii to California. And this lower map shows you the different routes that they took. 4 main routes, nearly 700 men who were sent to different camps according to the boatload that they were on, as you will see in some of the stories I tell. At least 4 of these men on transfer boat 3 had sons or a grandson in the US military while they were locked up. Reverend Fujitani had 1 son. Reverend Mr. Ohama also had a son, and Mr. Mizutari had a son, and these sons were in the military intelligence service in the Pacific. Also, Reverend Ikuma, the Shinto priest, had a grandson who was in the 100th Battalion, and I'll explain a little bit more about these units later. Mr. Mizutari lost his son in the Pacific War, which is a long story in my book. The other very important group, of course, consisted of those who lived with Reverend Watanabe in Barrack 64. Here he is in the corner on the right side. And this group of men actually included another Japanese school principal, Mr. Maehara, a shopkeeper, Mr. Izutsu, a small business owner, Mr. Nagami, and a railroad man, Mr. Yoshimatsu. At least 4 of these men, so actually those 4 men had sons in the military. Mr. Maehara had 2 sons. Mr. Nagami had 2 sons. Mr. Izutsu and Mr. Yoshimatsu both had 1 son in the Army. And as you will learn, Mr. Maehara and Mr. Nagami each lost a son fighting with the 100th 442 Regimental Combat Team in Italy. So Reverend Watanabe and his fellow internees witnessed the pride, apprehension, and anguish of those fathers whose sons were serving in the Pacific and Europe. They bore witness to this irony, one among which I call compounded ironies. So this is irony 1. The sons served in these military units, the Nisei sons, in the 100th Battalion, which was actually composed of 2 pre-war units, the 298th and the 299th, almost all draftees. And these were then combined into the 100th Battalion. The unit becomes controversial and orphaned became controversial and orphaned at the outbreak of the Pacific War because it was heavily composed of Japanese American draftees. And the military could not undraft them. But they were considered suspect due to wartime paranoia and racism. But this unit, the 100th Battalion, fought in North Africa, Italy, and France. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team also has a very interesting and well-known story. On December 7th, 1941, US-born Japanese were labeled enemy aliens, 4C, just like their immigrant fathers, and banned from military service. It wasn't until February 1st, 1943, that President Roosevelt was persuaded to authorize the formation of this unit, which was segregated. The 442nd was a segregated unit. And at that point, American Japanese men and women were finally allowed to enlist in the service. In Hawaii, this resulted in 10,000 volunteers, where only 1,500 had been anticipated by the Army. And some of them had fathers imprisoned in Santa Fe. Others actually enlisted from WRA camps, the War Relocation Authority camps, where they themselves were imprisoned. But this unit fought in Italy and France primarily. Then there was the Military Intelligence Service, which was actually formed pre-war. It was the least known unit, shrouded in secrecy for decades because of national security. It consisted of linguists who translated Japanese documents and communications, interrogated prisoners. There are many stories of prisoners being interrogated by men who looked like them. And they fought alongside the troops as well. They fought in Burma, the Pacific Islands, Okinawa, and were very important in occupied Japan. How I became aware of this first irony is interesting. I spent months at the National Archives digging through endless file boxes and came across a document, a list titled Japanese Civilian Internees from Hawaii with Sons in the Armed Forces of the United States. The government recorded the irony and the injustice in black and white. I remember being stunned, saddened, and angered all at the same time. This is an 11-page list of names of internees with sons serving in the US military while their fathers were locked up. Some sons were drafted, many volunteered despite, perhaps because of the intense racial prejudice of the time. As I pointed out before, with Maihara and Nagami, there were two sons, and one is listed here as being killed in action. In more than rare cases, there were 3 and 4 sons in military service by June 1945, when the list was revised. A total of 210 sons of 161 internees, interned fathers from Hawaii alone. Many others of, I'm sure there were many others of mainland Japanese families. How did the government officials become aware of this irony in the first place? This is an interesting case study in advocacy and literacy, in my view. I found correspondence between military and Justice Department administrators that reveals a possible answer. Apparently, Robert S. Miyata, a private from Hawaii in Company G, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, wrote a letter in late September 1943 to the Alien Enemy Control Unit, part of the Department of Justice, and headed at the time by Edward J. Ennis. It was apparently regarding his father's internment at Fort Missoula, Montana, so he had gotten shipped from Camp Livingston to Fort Missoula. This letter, and possibly others, led the director, Director Ennis, to write a letter on October 1st, 1943, so just shortly after he received the letter from Private Miyata. He wrote a letter on October 1st to the Provost Marshal General regarding, quote, the reconsideration of cases of Japanese internees from Alaska and Hawaii whose sons are members of the Armed Forces of the United States, unquote. So this set processes in motion, which I discuss in my book, but are too extensive to mention here. To the government's credit, and especially Edward Ennis, the moral irony of the situation apparently did not go unnoticed, and some action had begun within a month of Private Miata's letter. In my research, I began to realize another irony expressed in this poem by internee Muin Ozaki. The interned fathers and military sons physically crossed paths. He writes, sailing on separate decks, the son, a US soldier, his father, a prisoner of war. In some cases, they were on the same ship, literally or figuratively. The internees in Transferable 1 were sent to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin in February. And the 100th Battalion was secretly sent there for combat training, weeks after the fathers were sent to another camp. So they were ships passing in the night. A third irony I call unlikely visits. As I interviewed some of the veteran sons many of them were in their 80s by then. But as I interviewed some of these veteran sons whose fathers had been imprisoned, I learned that it was precisely because these young men who were all US born and in their late teens or early 20s had been shipped from Hawaii to the mainland for their military training, that some of them were also able to visit their immigrant fathers, who had been, of course, exiled to the mainland internment camps. So this was an improbability under other circumstances. Even those who may have had distant or strained relationships with their fathers before the war made the effort, reflecting their respect for one another and illustrating the power of filial piety over difficult relationships. Some visited their fathers in Camp Livingston, Louisiana, and here is one example. Hideo Tokaiden was drafted in June 1941 into the 298th Regiment, which eventually became the 100th Battalion. In June 1942, his unit was secretly shipped out to the mainland, as I mentioned before, to train at Camp McCoy. His father, Jinshi, was a small hotel owner and community leader. He had been arrested on December 7th and exiled from Hawaii in February by way of Camp McCoy, so had unknowingly crossed paths with his son. Although Hideo was not particularly close to his father, he said in his interview with me that he felt sorry for him being unjustly imprisoned. So in early May 1943, he made the trip by train from Wisconsin to Camp Livingston, Louisiana, to visit him. And that's a long way, certainly by train. He recalled objecting to someone saying, "Bring the Jap prisoner," in reference to his father, and complained to the captain about the soldiers' attitude. This treasured family photo shows the two men standing side by side with pine trees, the longleaf pine trees of Louisiana in the background. In a letter to his wife, the elder Tokaiden expressed his joy over his son's visit. End quote. Yesterday, Hideo unexpectedly visited me, but stayed for only 3 hours. He received a short break during maneuvers and came to see me. He was very happy when I gave him some of the Japanese pickles you had sent. Some of you would know this as takuang. Hideo seemed to be in good health. He wore 3 medals on his chest and looked great as a soldier. On June 1st, 1943, Hideo visited his father again, this time from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where the 100th Battalion had been transferred for further combat training. This time, PFC Tokaiden dissuaded his father from thoughts of repatriation to Japan. Then he shipped out to North Africa and to Salerno, Italy, where he was wounded and earned a Purple Heart and Bronze Star in Italy. Because many internees were incarcerated for longer periods at the Santa Fe Internment Camp or detention station than anywhere else, some sons made their way to the high desert from army camps like Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and the language training school for the military intelligence service at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. Ryozo Izutsu was a barrack-mate of my grandfather, and his son, Tadami, had volunteered for the 442nd in 1943. He writes, much to the dismay of my mother, who was very upset for father had been recently interned, unquote. He was 18 and was shipped from a sugar plantation camp on Kauai to Camp Shelby for his basic training. His interned father had been a plantation storekeeper on Kauai before being arrested and imprisoned in July 1942. He was transferred from Kauai to Sand Island in Honolulu and shipped into exile in September 42 on the 6th transfer boat to Angel Island. He was then sent to Lordsburg and Santa Fe internment camps, to the Lordsburg and Santa Fe internment camps in New Mexico, where he shared the same barrack with my grandfather in Santa Fe. Tadami writes in a family memoir, quote, while stationed at Camp Shelby, I visited father twice at the internment camp in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My friend also visited his father there, unquote. On their first furlough, the taxi driver taking them to the prison camp from town asked them, how come you have somebody in here when you're in that uniform? So the contradiction was apparent even to the cabbie. In his memoir, the son continues, after my second visit to father, I was moved and with an 18-year-old's determination, wrote a letter to the then commanding officer of the US Armed Forces, General Marshall, to consider releasing my father from his internment. For I was now actively serving the United States of America, proof of my devotion and willingness to die for my country. In June 1944, Private Yoshiaki Fujitani was stationed at Fort Snelling, Minnesota for military intelligence training at the MIS language school. Although upset that his father had been interned, he had volunteered to serve in the MIS at age 20. His father, Reverend Kodo Fujitani, a Buddhist minister, whom I introduced you to earlier, had been shipped on Transfer Boat 3 along with my grandfather and in Santa Fe since June 1943. On his first furlough, Yoshiaki decided to visit his father, whom he found behind a high barbed wire fence. He writes in an essay in the collection Japanese Eyes, American Heart, it was an incongruous scene. A son in the US Army meets his father, who is suspected by the government of being a potentially dangerous enemy. He was dressed in a tan suit, sporting a goatee. It touched me to think that he felt he had to be dressed in a formal way to greet his son who was serving in the US Army. So they had a quiet visit. In an email to me in 2003, Reverend Fujitani, who had risen eventually to the rank of Master Sergeant and retired as a Buddhist bishop, wrote, all I remember is that we compared our lives in camp, me in the Army and him in detention camp. We were having the same kind of food, like powdered eggs and luncheon meat. We both complained about the breakfast food. I think the rest of the time was spent talking about the family. At one point, the father and son stood and had this picture taken by a photographer with the familiar juniper bespeckled hillside of Santa Fe behind the camp in the background. Decades later, the son wrote of the photograph, and I quote, "To the casual viewer, it must be an uninteresting photo of two rather grim gentlemen. But for me, it has a very special meaning, since it is a souvenir photo of my dad and myself taken right outside the barbed wire fence of the camp in Santa Fe. That picture serves as a reminder of an intensely emotional moment in my life, when I traveled hundreds of miles from Minnesota to meet my father after a separation of 2 years. About a year before that picture was taken, I had written a letter to my father from Hawaii, expressing hope that since we were not very close and unable to sit down and have a good heart-to-heart talk in the past, the next time we meet, we ought to do that, over a bottle of beer or two," which obviously was just a 19-year-old son talking big to the father he missed. When the meeting finally did occur, all the bravado and confidence deserted me, and all I could muster was, "Dad, how are you?" There was nothing else that could be said at that time. That moment is captured in the photograph. It doesn't show in our faces, but I know that we were happy to see each other, and I'm sure Dad felt very proud standing next to his American soldier son in his buck private's uniform. And one story he told me was that he actually had his father stand on a slight raised area so that he could be taller than Yoshiaki himself. In many ways, the gravest irony, having the greatest poignancy, has to do with the sons being killed in action, fighting for the country which had unjustly imprisoned their fathers. I noted that the government document shown earlier listed 7 Hawaii internee sons who had died in combat in Europe and the Pacific by June 1945. In chapter 7, I wrote, "Making this observation, realizing how the loss of the imprisoned fathers compounded the harsh irony of their imprisonment, I felt moved to learn and in some way to relate these stories in commemoration of the sacrifices of both the fathers and the sons." So I've listed all 7 here. PFC Arthur Akira Morihara, Tech Sergeant Yukitaka Terry Mizutari, Staff Sergeant Toshio Murakami, PFC Kihachiro Hota, Sergeant Hiroshi Nagami, PFC Iwao Blandi Takemoto, and First Lieutenant Saburo Maehara. Due to time limits, however, I will focus on 4 of them who fought in Italy and France. What the imprisoned fathers may not have known was when and where their sons died. Somehow the losses of the fathers and the injustice of their imprisonment seemed to me most acute in those moments. And these stories touched me deeply. So deeply, in fact, that I got both of my knees replaced and joined 3 tour groups to Italy and France in 2019 to follow some of the World War II battle paths, with families and friends of the Nisei soldiers. Mountains of memory. So I'll provide here brief biographical and historical sketches for the son's sacrifices. Arthur Akira Morihara was born and educated on the island of Hawaii, from which his father, Usaku, a shop owner in Kona, here he is in the middle, was arrested. Arthur worked in Honolulu, was probably drafted into the US Army like Hideo Tokaiden sometime in 1941, before the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. After that date, you'll remember US-born Japanese who were American citizens, of course, were declared enemy aliens like their immigrant fathers. And this was by executive order. They were banned from military service until 1943 with the creation of the 442. After basic training on Oahu, Morihara was transferred to Company A of the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was then, as you know, sent to Camp McCoy, then Camp Shelby, Mississippi, for advanced combat training before being shipped overseas to Algeria. Of Hiroshi Nagami, my grandfather notes that he was the third son of Genichi Nagami. His barrack mate and a small business owner. As I understand, he had a soda factory of some sort. Born like Arthur Morihara on the Big Island, Hiroshi received his public school education on Hawaii Island, then enrolled at the Honolulu Business College. So he left the Big Island and went to Honolulu before entering military service. In March 1943, undoubtedly a volunteer, he was inducted into the Army training at Camp Shelby together with Morihara, Tokaiden, and others. But unlike those in the 100th Battalion, he served with the 442 in Company F, 2nd Battalion, alongside his brother in Italy. The only native of the island of Kauai among the 7 sons was Iwao Blondie Takimoto, whose picture I was able to find in this larger picture of K Company. He was born and attended public schools there on Kauai and was employed as a welder for the Army prior to volunteering for military service. Inducted in March 1943, he trained at Camp Shelby with Nagami in the 442nd, but in Company K, 3rd Battalion, and served in Italy and France. The last of the 7 sons of Hawaii internees killed in action was actually the first to serve in the military. Saburo Maehara was from Maui, the 3rd son of Teichiro Maehara, whom I introduced you to earlier, a Japanese language school principal who was in my grandfather's barrack, and also a friend. Saburo attended public schools on Maui, as well as the University of Hawaii on Oahu, having participated in the university's Army ROTC program. He received his 2nd lieutenant's commission in June 1936 upon graduating from the university. He became a public school teacher, an agricultural instructor at a Maui high school, and in May 1941 married Louise Sasai. They had a daughter, Susan. And in an interview in 2008, Lieutenant Maehara's brother-in-law, Sam Sasai, told me that Saburo was a very caring, quote, a very caring teacher interested in his students being successful. He also told me that his younger siblings looked up to him and considered him a leader. And he also told me that he, Sam, who also served in the 442, that Saburo looked out for him at the battlefront. His not being called to active duty until March 1943 placed Lieutenant Maehara with the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the combined unit, which I'll explain in a little while, Being commissioned as a second lieutenant, he was rightfully among the officers of the 442. The majority of them were Caucasian, but it had been over 6 years since he'd been commissioned. So when the 442 arrived for training at Camp Shelby, he was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for officers training. Valor, as you know, is paid for with casualties. The 100th left the 442 troops still training at Camp Shelby in August 1943 and entered combat in September 1943 in the south of Italy. Moving from Salerno down here towards Cassino up here. PFC Morihara was killed in action on October 23rd, 1943, when Company A was part of what war correspondent Lynn Cross describes as the fight to capture the small towns of Alife and San Angelo de Alife. So San Angelo here and Alife there. So he was killed somewhere in between this area. She says that this was the fight to capture the small towns where they were stopped by enemy tanks. According to Cross, this involved some of the most difficult fighting of the war. In the village town of San Angelo de Alife, we found, on this trip that I went on, we found this monument dedicated to those in the 34th Division who died in that fighting. The infamous battle at Cassino in January 1944 was so devastating that the ranks of the 100th Battalion, which was overstrength with 5 infantry companies compared to the normal 3 companies, were depleted by the time it was withdrawn from Cassino. So the 1st Battalion, or the 442, still in training at Camp Shelby, had to be rushed to the 100th at Anzio as replacements. Lieutenant Maihara was sent into battle with these replacements. And I just wanted to note that the 100th, by this time, then was absorbed into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, but by presidential dispensation, was allowed to retain the designation 100th Battalion instead of 1st Battalion for demonstrated valor. Ironically, it was a designation originally foisted on them because they were an orphaned unit. And they were welcomed at that time only by Lieutenant General Mark Clark of the 5th Army. Other generals didn't want to have anything to do with them. So having started at Anzio with the 100th, Lieutenant Maihara was there when the 442nd arrived north of Rome. So he was already there when the 442nd, the bulk of the 442nd arrived north of Rome in June 1944. The 442nd's initial battle was at Suvareto Belvedere. And although the 2nd and 3rd battalions, it's Suvareto down here, although the 2nd and 3rd battalions had problems typical of initiation into combat, the 100th showed off its experience by skillfully maneuvering behind the Germans at Belvedere and earned a presidential unit citation for what Cross calls, quote, its brilliant performance, unquote. As the 34th Division drove the Germans north, the 442nd would have arrived to cross the Cecina River, as you can see here. It's north of that river that the Germans decided to make a stand to delay the Allied advance. And it is in this area that Sergeant Nagami, as well as Staff Sergeant Murakami and PFC Hota were killed during the Rome Arno campaign. But Sergeant Nagami was killed near Falonica, and I'm not sure exactly where that is, but it's somewhere in this area on July 12th. According to the book In Freedom's Cause, Sergeant Nagami was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest combat medal for, quote, extreme gallantry and risk of life in combat, unquote. In September 1944, the 100th 442 was secretly transferred from Italy to the south of France, and PFC Takemoto and K Company, 3rd Battalion, as well as the 100th and the 2nd Battalion, were engaged in the liberation of French villages like Bruyères and Bifontaine, and the now famed rescue of the Lost Battalion, the Texas unit trapped in the Vosges Mountains. Here's Takemoto again. And a map of the area. The Lost Battalion here in the right corner. It was somewhere in the hills and mountains approaching the entrapped unit along this blue line here, where PFC Takemoto was wounded and died on October 28th, 1944. The very next day, October 29th, the 3rd and 100th Battalions fought the bloodiest battle of that effort at, and pardon my French pronunciation, La Croisette Junction, charging against enemy automatic fire and hand grenades to rescue the Texans. PFC Takemoto was among the extraordinary number of over 2,000 Japanese American troops killed or wounded to save 280 Texans. Tadami Izutsu, whose visit to his father I described earlier, recalls getting a glimpse of his childhood friend after he was killed. And he wrote, Blondie and I played football on opposite high school teams on Kauai. He was a husky, well-built, healthy person, but it takes only a small piece of shrapnel the size of half of one's thumb to take a life. May the good Lord be with him always. Mountains of Memory. We were there in the Vosges to see the remnants of foxholes in the once treacherous forests, and to participate in the ceremony honoring the heroism of the Nisei troops in the rescue. I was very happy that I could put this little stone with his name on it, with Takemoto's name on it, as other people had done in a similar way. First Lieutenant Maehara was the oldest of the 7 sons of Hawaii internees, the first to serve and the last among them to give his life in combat when he died on his 30th birthday, April 5th, 1945, in Italy during the Po Valley campaign. That day was the beginning of the 442nd's final campaign, the breach of the Gothic line, the line of German defenses, from April 5th to May 8th, 1945. As with many battles, success is set up by the sacrifice of the diversionary units that distract the enemy's attention from the main objective. As you can see here, the main objective was Mount Fogarito. That was the role of the 100th Battalion, the distraction here. From early on April 5th, the 100th had started its climbing attack of the hills toward Mount Fulgarito. The Germans were focused on the 100th, and in that battle, First Lieutenant Maehara lost his life near Ripa, Italy, to a German mortar shell, according to Colonel Virgil Miller. The actual breach of the Gothic line occurred the following day, April 6th, and is physically the most dramatic of the 442nd's battles. Nisei troops had to climb the formidable cliff fronting Mount Fulgarito, this cliff here. And they did it at night in full gear and carrying extra ammunition. And they did it instructed not to utter a sound if they should lose their footing and fall. And a few did fall without uttering a sound. Early the next morning, they surmounted the cliff, surprised 8 sleeping Germans, and took them prisoner. And by shortly afternoon, they had captured the German observation post at the summit of Mount Fulgarito. One of my traveling companions, the only one who made it up to the top of Fulgarito, Mr. Sakoda, took this photo from the top of the mountain and gives you an idea of its height and the many mountains beyond. This action eliminated the artillery threat in that area and was strategic in ending the war in Europe. Military historian Eric Saul has reported that the 100th 442 did in 30 minutes what 30,000 people could not do in 6 months. So the Nisei distinguished themselves without question. And this is just a snapshot view. The 100th Infantry Battalion, before it merged with the 442, became known as the Purple Heart Battalion because of its heavy losses. And after it merged as the 1st Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, they became the most highly decorated unit in Army history, in US military history. The Military Intelligence Service is said to have shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and saved thousands of lives. In a prison camp thousands of miles away in New Mexico, these young soldiers were not only the sons of their fathers, but also of communities of men in camp society. Their fathers' friends, men from their hometowns. They had communities of fathers. Many photos of the sons' visits show the soldier son in uniform, surrounded by men of the, in this case, the Kona Kohala community, or Kauai men. And here you can see Mr. Izutsu, the father of Tadami. One rare, rather startling photo pictures 9 unidentified Japanese American soldiers sitting in a row in dress uniforms, their buttons aligned, with a large group of internees standing in the snow behind them. And the snow, if you've been in Santa Fe, is pretty familiar. The snow-covered brush suggests a definite Santa Fe winter. And when a son died, theirs was a community loss, a shared sorrow. In his memoir, journalist Yasutaro Soga records the Buddhist memorial service for PFC Arthur Akita Morihara of the 100th, the first soldier son of a Hawaii internee to be killed in action. He writes, on December 9th, 1943, it snowed heavily all day. The roads were slippery and dangerous. It was the 49th day after the death in Italy of Mr. Akita Morihara, the third son of Mr. Usaku Morihara, a shop owner from Kona. A memorial service was held at the Lower Town Mess Hall in the afternoon, and many internees attended. This was the first service in the camp for a fallen Japanese American soldier. On December 10th, 1943, Isao Kato, who was from Kona, like Morihara, like the Moriharas, wrote a more personal letter home about Akita Morihara's death. We had notification, he writes, we had notification that Isao's younger brother, Akira, had died. We held services and I've been busy. Today is Akira's 48th Memorial Day. Kona friends had a memorial service for him. From early morning, it has snowed heavily, so we had a very cold, quiet, and short and solemn service. Isao's papa, who had drained his strength and spirit, now seems to have settled some. We do what we can to console him, but nothing we can say or do is that uplifting. It is so very pitiful. How can one understand the loss of a son in battle and the father imprisoned? Many of these services were multi-faith, because you can see Reverend Fujitani, Yoshiaki's father, was one of the priests officiating, but my grandfather was also in attendance as a Christian. He was a man from Hawaii. On the same topic, Soga mentions another service. On the night of the 13th of December, 1943, internees from Maui held a memorial service for 8 Japanese American soldiers from Maui who had been killed in Italy. The Reverends Ryugen Matsuda and Tamasaku Watanabe delivered sermons, and Mr. Tokiji Takei said a few words on behalf of the families. It was later reported that of Japanese American soldiers from Maui, 8 had been killed and 180 injured. And now in December 1943, when these Nisei soldiers killed and wounded in action must have referred primarily to members of the 100th Battalion, who, like Arthur Morihara, were among the first Japanese American troops deployed to Europe. The 442nd didn't arrive until months later. So Reverend Watanabe, my grandfather, was not at all a stranger to this loss, but he must have felt it deeply, especially since he spoke at that service, having had a long 13-year ministry on Maui. And he may have known some of the young men even as children. So, mountains of memory, depths of our gratitude as descendants. The first mountains are those in New Mexico that the Issei saw daily and painted. The memories those mountains evoked for them. Those were two paintings, possibly from an art class where different individuals rendered the color differently. But I was very honored to be able to have Reverend Matsuura's painting on my book cover to evoke those mountains. Our memories and gratitude go to the Issei, who withstood the injustice and the insult, survived their incarceration with dignity, and returned to their lives to allow for ours, our fathers and our grandfathers. The second mountains are the metaphorical mountains of distrust and prejudice that the Nisei soldiers had to surmount in the military and in US society, thereby creating a different environment for their American Japanese families who succeeded them. And of course, the literal mountains of France and Italy, where they fought to liberate the French and Italian villagers who have not forgotten them. Lieutenant Maehara's death was a sacrifice, part of the sacrifice to allow the surprise breach of the Gothic line. But the deaths of each of the men of the 100th 442 MIS were sacrifices for their families and loved ones, for all American Japanese who would follow them, for their country. The sons must be and are being remembered. This is a memorial on Mount Fogarito. You could see the cross on the mountain, and below that is the 442nd insignia right here. I thought this was also very moving, that Ed was able to write this note, I'm assuming, kept in a box at the top. Thank you for remembering our fathers, signed by Fukuda, Sakoda, Shimogaki, Hiyame, and Higa. Sadao Munemori, this memorial to Sadao Munemori also exists in Pietrasanta, Italy. He was in the 100th Battalion. He died on the same day in the same attack as Saburo Maehara. And he was the first Nisei to receive the Medal of Honor, until 20 others who had been overlooked were upgraded to receive the Medal of Honor. But this statue is in this beautiful little square in the middle of the town. And there's the Bifontaine Memorial in Honolulu, which says, in October 1944, the 442nd wrote the word liberty with their blood. Bifontaine remembers March 1993. And of course, there are grave sites. When we were in the Vosges, a parade and ceremony was held by the village of Gruyere to honor Lawson Sakai, one of the last 442nd veterans unable to make the trip. He passed away in June. A former mayor of Gruyere has said, and I quote, "What they did, what he, Lawson Sakai, did for us, for our liberty, for the peace is unforgettable. They are heroes. He is a hero forever. And like real heroes, so modest, so warm. His soul will live in our forests forever. Chris, may we see the video now?
Yes, I'll get that started.
Is there sound?
Sorry about that, but I think I've got it here.
I don't need to do anything, do I?
No, no.
Okay.
This is all me. Sorry about that. I had that muted. I'm going to just stop the share real quick and then come back to this. I apologize, everyone. Okay, 1 second here. I'm in a kind of an infinite mirror of no, I apologize for this again.
Should I try to hit the I could try to hit the start button on my screen.
No, I apologize. I am going to find it again. Okay. Again, I should. Okay, I think this is on. Okay, I apologize for that. Let's try this again.
nous avons commémoré le 14 juillet la fête nationale et la libération de la ville de Bruyères par les Américains. Nous avons été en présence du dernier vétéran aujourd'hui à Bruyères et aujourd'hui encore, son attitude force respect vis-à-vis de la population de notre région.
Les Américains, c'est nos libérateurs. Hein. Ils sont combattus, ils étaient tout jeunes. Et là, il y a des vétérans, il y en a un qui est là, il a 96 ans. Il était tout jeune, il a combattu avec ses copains. Là. On est ému devant les monuments, on sait que moi, ça choque. Hein. C'est à l'âge là. Hein.
La population locale a été durement touchée ici. C'est pour ça que nous organisons des manifestations comme aujourd'hui, pour leur dire encore merci et cultiver le devoir de mémoire.
Bruyères ne peut pas oublier cette histoire. Il faut savoir que les combats de ces hommes ont été absolument héroïques et j'ai tenu à saluer dignement M. Lawson Sakai parce qu'il était là il y a 75 ans, il a été blessé. Je tenais absolument à le mettre à l'honneur, même si c'est le 14 juillet, et dans le cadre de la fraternité des peuples, je trouvais que c'était tout à fait approprié de l'honorer.
Ici, on y pense encore souvent et on tient absolument à conserver cette mémoire.
Okay.
Okay, now what do I need to do to get back to my slides?
So you can, let me, sorry, you should be able to hit share screen.
Do I have to do it again? Because my slide is right up here.
No, yeah, so if you hit your share screen button on the bottom of your Zoom screen.
No, but I've already got my screen up.
Oh, you do? Okay, so you select the screen you want to share and then go down to, you might not be.
I think I've got it.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Such memorials.
Oh, I don't think that's activated yet.
Oh, and maybe I'm not on. Am I on the screen?
You may not be. You might have to press escape.
Oh, yeah.
Are you looking at your PowerPoint right now? Or you were?
I was, yeah.
Yeah. So then what you'll do is go, now that you're have escaped from there, you'll go back to your Zoom window.
Okay, I got it. Now go to share screen.
Mm-hmm. There we go. And then you can select the slide itself that you want to begin with.
Okay. Sorry, folks, technology is a little bit far beyond me, but do you think everything's working right now?
That looks good. You have it.
Thank you. Such memorials represent the hope that American soldiers like the Nisei brought to the people they liberated. A great irony because their fathers and relatives may have been locked up behind barbed wire in the US. So their immigrant fathers' incarceration must also be remembered. A reminder of the imperfections and struggles in forming, quote, a more perfect union, unquote. Memorialized here in the Santa Fe Internment Camp marker. Our memories and our gratitude must thus reflect the depth and complexity of historical moments. We, as those they left behind, must never forget the fragility of the liberty that the Nisei fought for and the constant vigilance we must maintain to protect it. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Should I go out of this share now?
Yeah, we can end your share screen.
Share. Okay.
Here we go.
Okay, thank you, Gail. That was incredible. We appreciate your sharing of your story, of your journey and your research. And we actually have some time now to have some questions. And we do have a question in the chat from Tom. And his question to you, Gail, is there any information about whether the men who served in divisionary operations were aware of their role?
Aware of their role?
Yes. So the men who served in divisionary operations. And that is from Tom Copeland.
Oh, I'm not sure exactly what he means by divisionary.
Well, I think it's diversionary.
Oh, I'm sorry,
As
diversionary.
the role as diversions.
Oh, diversionary.
Sorry, diversionary roles.
Where they, so in other words, were the soldiers in the 100th who were diversions from the main assault on Mount Fogarito, were they aware?
Correct.
I imagine that those at the, in the leadership roles may have been aware. And Lieutenant Maihara would have been one of those in the leadership role. But as far as the, the average soldier, I don't know the extent to which they would have known that.
Okay, we have another question from Michelle Kells, who also is thanking you for your beautiful and moving presentation. Such incredible research and stirring reflection. I am especially moved by your conceptualization of metaphorical mountains of memory and compounded ironies as a way to organize these stories and histories. I am wondering about these extended metaphors and their implications. Mountains of memory represent the above the surface narratives, depths of gratitude represent the below the surface narratives. My question is, what does the surface line represent? Is the surface line above which memory and gratitude rest? U.S. national identity and citizenship for these Japanese American families.
Michelle's question is incredible. And actually, it would be something I would need to think about, because this is actually a conversation that is, I guess, quite current in the field of, in the academic field that she and I at one time shared. And I'm very interested in knowing more about the terminology, because I've been out of this for quite a long time. I'm wondering if Michelle could clarify the separation that she's making between the mountains above and the mountains and depths. In other words, I see this as a, in many ways, as a visual and emotional metaphor, kind of metaphor myself. One of the things that impressed me the most when I was on this long journey in Italy and France were the literal mountains, and the fact that these young men from Hawaii, many of them, not all were from Hawaii, of course, but the ones I related to were the ones from Hawaii, and that they would have, this would have been completely unfamiliar terrain, just physical terrain from the island kind of environment they would have been used to. So that the fact that they were able to surmount the physical mountains, or to fight in the physical mountains, was so impressive to me, because it it also started to represent other things to me as I was traveling, and especially since I've returned. I think that has really been quite profound for me to think in terms of the experience of these young men. And then it starts to fold into the experiences of their fathers and their descendants. So in terms of the memory, we're talking about generations of memory. And we're also talking about generations of gratitude, you know, different layers of gratitude. So I'm really interested in the concept of the line. I couldn't quite get all of that in the question, Kathy.
Okay.
If Michelle would like, I can allow her to speak if she wanted to elaborate on that.
That would be great.
Yes, that would be neat.
Michelle, do you?
Yeah, I'm on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Gail, as I was looking at your presentation and then thinking about the metaphors you were using about mountains and the beautiful representations, the photographs and the sketches. And then when I was hearing how you were describing that generational depth of memory, I was seeing a surface line that was that space between the mountains and then depth meaning something below the surface, right? Like a valley, a depth metaphorically below the surface. Well, I was wondering then, as you were extending those metaphors, what was that surface line that was between the two and that's left? Can you visualize what I'm saying?
Kind of, but I guess I don't see, I'm not sure if I quite see a line, you know. In other words, it seems in the photo the video that I showed you, you know, you have the mountains and the valleys, and they blend, you know, there is no line between them. So I think you know, metaphorically speaking, the depths of gratitude that we feel is very much tied in with the memories themselves, you know, the challenges and everything else that we encounter. So I think this is something that I might want to talk with you about more at some other time to explore, because I'm not sure beyond that at the moment how I would interpret the surface line itself. I guess I don't see a line myself.
Well, thank you. It was a powerful.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your comments and your questions.
And Dr. Okawa, we have one more question from Nora. And she starts off by saying, until reading your book, I was largely unaware of Hawaiian, is it Issei?
Yes.
Issei, having been interned, maybe due to the often repeated story about the rivalry between the Katonks and Buddha heads, which wasn't resolved until the Hawaiian boys were taken to the camps so they could see what the mainland families were facing. Why do you think the story of the Hawaiian exiles is missing? Is it really just a case of them being outnumbered by the mainland prisoners?
I think that may be a factor. I think that's a really interesting point, actually, that I think the Hawaii men, because they were really a minority, that the Issei who were sent to the mainland camps were a relative minority compared to those West Coast people who were taken, you know, completely. Everyone was taken on the West Coast. So even in when you think about the Hawaii population, the Issei were selected. This was a very selected group primarily community leaders. And they were taken away, you know, on the first day. It's very secretively in a way. I mean, the whole thing was quite secretive. They picked them up and they just took them away. And so families often didn't know what had happened to the fathers until weeks later. It depended on which island they were on, actually. But the fact that there was a selectiveness about the Issei fathers meant that many of the men in Hawaii who enlisted or who were drafted didn't know that this had happened. And so they wouldn't have been sensitive to internment in the way that the soldiers who were actually either drafted or volunteered out of the camps, out of the incarceration camps from the West Coast, would have known about it, of course, because they had either been drafted later, much later, but they had been either volunteered or they had been drafted later from the camps. But in Hawaii, many people, because it was such a secretive operation on the part of the FBI and the military, many Hawaii soldiers wouldn't have known about it. And so they would have been informed of the incarceration in a very different way, as Nora points out, in relation to this rivalry between the two groups. And the story is that when they were exposed to the internment, the concentration camps that the West Coast people were sent to, that was when they really started to understand what the Nisei from the mainland were coming out of. And I think that was a major turning point, as I understand it. It was a major turning point in the bonding between the Hawaii people and the mainland Nisei.
Thank you. And if we don't have any further questions, I did want to mention that we are having a symposium here in April, on April 23rd of 2022, as well as a Smithsonian exhibition that will be in October of 2022 through December. And I just wondered, Gail, if you wanted to mention anything about that or just give a brief summary of what we can expect to see at those two events.
Well, certainly, and I'm very happy to have ended with the image of the marker, the Santa Fe Internment Camp marker, because our plan is to honor the 20th anniversary of the establishment of that marker. It was a controversial event at the time, and we want to preserve to honor the people who participated and made the decision to actually mark the fact that Santa Fe had an internment camp there. So we want to explore not only the experience of the Issei, what happened with them, but also the experience of people in Santa Fe in relation to actually the time itself back in the 40s, and as well as the controversy in the late 1990s, early 2000s, before the establishment of the marker in 2002. So it will be the 20th anniversary, and we want to explore the different aspects of the not only the camp itself, but the controversy and how all of this relates into the present. We hope people will be interested in coming to our event and attending. Also, we intend to have a pilgrimage to the marker. So there will be some ceremony involved in all of this. And we hope that families as well as friends will come to participate. This is on April 23rd, 2022. And we are hoping that this will also lay some groundwork of understanding for the Smithsonian exhibit, which is going to be held at the museum in the fall. I believe it's in October, starting in October, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah, going through December. So,
Yes.
and it's called Righting a Wrong, and it is a traveling show from the Smithsonian Institution, and we will have some more information about that on the New Mexico History Museum's website. So, you know, keep posted for that. And
Yes. So I think we have quite a number of events related to this talk, and you know that we will be able to fill in a lot of gaps, I think, I hope, for people who are interested in the subject.
right. As one last comment, can you mention something about the documentary that we recently were able to pull together a grant, and we will be doing a documentary on the marker as well as the symposium event, and there'll be some interviewing of people associated with the internment story. So that will be something else that the museum is engaged in at the moment.
Yes, we're hoping that we'll have good coverage of the event, and that a filmmaker will be putting a short documentary together so that we have a fuller story about the Santa Fe Internment Camp itself in terms of the history, the events in 2002 when the marker was established, and how that ties in with the current political environment as well.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Okawa. It was fabulous and very informative. Your research is just fascinating, and we really appreciate you. So thank you again for sharing.
Thanks very much. And thank you everyone who was able to join in from all over. It's not the fact that Nora was able to join us maybe from Italy. That would be just very, very interesting. And Tom in Canada and Michelle in New Mexico. Those are the only people I know of right now, but I think I have some family from Hawaii. So
great.
We've got a pretty widespread audience. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.